I woke up that morning to the sound of splintering wood, sharp, hollow cracks echoing across the pasture. At first, I thought a tree had gone down in the night storm, but when I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, the truth hit me like a punchline I didn't see coming. There they were, my Bison massive, hulking shadows moving slow and steady through the dawn mist, right into the HOA's pristine white picket-fenced paradise. And the best part, the very same fence they'd spent months bragging about was folding like a cheap card table under 1,000 pounds of horn and muscle. Just 2 days earlier, Karen Queen of the HOA had smugly padlocked my ranch gate, claiming it was for the safety of the community. She had no idea the only thing she'd locked in was the problem she was about to regret. Because when you pit a steel padlock against a hungry herd of bison, well, let's just say, the fence never stood a chance. My name's Jack Turner. I'm 54 years old, and I've been a rancher my entire life. Some folks are born in a hospital room with bright lights and nurses bustling around. I was born in the back bedroom of my parents' ranch house, with the smell of hay drifting in from the open window and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. My father liked to say I could tell the difference between a cow and a bull before I could tell the difference between red and blue. I live on 200 acres of rolling Montana grassland, land my grandfather carved out of wild country when the only neighborhood was the wildlife. Now, the horizon is a mix of amber fields, dark pine lines, and, unfortunately, the cookie-cutter rooftops of a gated community that popped up about 7 years ago. Back then, I didn't think much of it. City folks wanted a piece of the country lifestyle, and I figured as long as they stayed on their side of the fence, we'd get along just fine. I raise bison not because it's easy, but because it's in my blood. My father switched from cattle to bison in the late 80s after realizing they're hardier, less prone to disease, and, as he put it, too stubborn to let the world tell them what to do. That line could have just as easily described him, or me, for that matter. Bison aren't like cows. They don't plod along obediently. They move with the slow, deliberate confidence of an animal that survived ice ages. The smallest cow in my herd weighs around 1,000 pounds. The biggest bull could push 1,800. Their shoulders are like battering rams. Their horns curve like scythes. When they look at you, you feel the weight of centuries in their eyes. Life on the ranch is a rhythm: early mornings, late nights, weather dictating your plans. I'm usually up before the sun, with a mug of black coffee in hand, checking fence lines, making sure the herd's where it should be, and fixing whatever nature or time decided to break overnight. It's hard work, sure, but it's honest work. And when the day ends, there's nothing like sitting on my porch, watching the sun bleed orange and purple over the hills, feeling the world go quiet. Or at least, it used to be quiet. When that HOA community went up, it brought a new soundtrack to my days: lawnmowers humming in perfect unison, the beep of garbage trucks backing up, and, worst of all, the grating voice of Karen Miller. Karen, bless her heart, was the self-appointed queen bee of the HOA before the paint had even dried on her front porch. She's in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an iron grip on her clipboard. She's the kind of person who can turn a neighborly good morning into a subtle lecture about property values. The thing is, I'm not part of their HOA. Never was, never will be. My land's been in the family too long to fall under their jurisdiction, and that eats at Karen like a splinter under the skin. I'm outside her control, and for someone like her, that's unacceptable. For the first couple of years, she mostly kept to herself, though I'd catch her giving my trucks the stink eye when they rolled past on the shared road. I figured she was just another suburban transplant learning that country life comes with dust, smells, and the occasional critter wandering through your yard. Then the letters started. They weren't addressed to me officially, probably because she knew she had no legal standing, but they came in neat little envelopes with friendly notice typed in big, cheerful letters. Inside, she'd politely request that I ask my delivery drivers to avoid excessive noise when using the road near her home. I ignored the first one. The second came a week later, this time mentioning preserving the peaceful environment our community strives for. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a one-and-done thing. Still, I kept my cool. I've dealt with stubborn bulls, bitter winters, and busted tractors in the middle of calving season. One overzealous HOA president didn't seem like much to worry about. But it wasn't just about me. The shared road she was complaining about wasn't her personal driveway. It was a public right-of-way, my property, and 3 other ranches beyond mine depended on it for everything from feed deliveries to emergency services. Karen didn't see it that way. In her mind, anything that passed within sight of her picket fence was subject to her rules. I didn't know it at the time, but that mindset was going to turn into a full-blown war. And like most bad wars, it wouldn't start with a bang. It'd start with something small, petty, and just annoying enough to make you grit your teeth. For me, that was the moment I realized peace and quiet on the ranch wasn't guaranteed anymore. I had a feeling Karen wasn't the type to quit once she set her sights on a target. And unfortunately, that target was me. But here's the thing, there's a saying out here, you don't pick a fight with a man who's got more patience than you have time. And Karen, she had no idea just how patient I could be. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. It was early spring when Karen made her first real move. The snow had just melted, the ground was soft, and the air still carried that damp smell of thawing earth. I was in the middle of restocking feed my truck idling by the gate when a white SUV rolled up and stopped right in the middle of the road. The driver's side window slid down, and there she was, Karen Miller. Sunglasses the size of tea saucers, hair sprayed into a helmet, and that clipboard balanced on the steering wheel like it was part of the dashboard. "Jack," she said, her tone somewhere between a greeting and a reprimand. "We need to talk about your trucks." I leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. "What about them? They're too loud, and they come through here far too often. My homeowners have been complaining. It's disrupting the peace." I nodded slowly. "Uh-huh. You do realize this is the only road into my property, right?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've looked into alternative routes. There's a back road. That back road," I cut in, "is a washed-out logging trail through 3 miles of private land that isn't mine." "You planning to buy that land for me?" She blinked, thrown off for just a second, then recovered. "I'm simply asking you to be considerate. My community values tranquility." I gave her a polite smile. "I value getting feed to my animals before they go hungry." Her SUV pulled away with a curt wave, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I came back from town to find a brand new sign planted in the gravel turnout near my property line. Big, bold letters, "No unauthorized vehicles beyond this point." At the bottom, in smaller print, "By order of the Lakeshore Estates HOA." Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough property disputes to know that sign was nothing more than decorative. That road's been public since my grandfather's time, but the thing about signs is they work on people who don't know better. My delivery guy called me that afternoon, hesitant to come through. Said a lady stopped him at the sign and told him it was private property. I had to drive out there myself, wave him in and explain the situation. That was strike 1. Strike 2 came 3 days later. I caught 2 men I didn't recognize walking along my fence line, taking photos of my pasture. They claimed they were contracted for a safety inspection by the HOA. When I asked to see their credentials, they mumbled something about community standards and made a quick exit. Word gets around fast in a small town, and by the end of the week, I'd heard from my neighbor 2 miles down the road that Karen was telling anyone who'd listen that my bison were a public safety hazard. That one made me laugh. These were animals that had lived here longer than her vinyl-sided palace. They didn't bother anyone unless bothered first. But in her world, everything beyond the HOA's pristine lawns was wild and dangerous. The funny thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong about one thing: bison can be dangerous. They're unpredictable, and they have no interest in your opinion of their behavior. But here's the difference out here. We know how to handle them. You keep your distance, you keep your fences strong, and you respect their space. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to think a rulebook and a clipboard could keep them in line. One afternoon, I was hauling hay bales when I noticed her standing just beyond the fence, snapping photos on her phone. When she saw me, she waved like we were old friends. "Just documenting for our records," she called out. I wanted to ask, "Your records for what?" But I let it slide. I figured the more rope she gave herself, the more she'd eventually trip over it. That was the thing. These weren't big, explosive confrontations. They were little chips at the stone, one after another. The kind of constant pressure that wears you down if you let it. But I wasn't about to let it. What I didn't know then was that Karen was testing me. She was pushing to see how far she could go before I pushed back. And somewhere in her mind, I think she believed I'd eventually roll over. She didn't understand that out here. If you start something, you'd better be ready to see it through. By the end of that month, the air between us was thick with tension. Every time my trucks passed through, I half expected to find another sign, another stranger with a camera, another friendly notice taped to my gate. But the real turning point, the moment this simmering irritation started to boil, came one Saturday morning in late April. I woke up to the sound of hammering, not on my property, but close enough that I could hear it plain as day. When I went to investigate, I found a row of orange traffic cones blocking half the road, with 2 HOA volunteers installing a speed bump right in the middle of it. No warning, no permission from the county, just a slab of asphalt rising like a black scar across the gravel. When I confronted them, they told me Karen had authorized it for safety. I stood there, staring at that bump, thinking about the weight of my loaded feed trucks, the way they'd bottom out over that hump, the repairs it'd cause. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about trucks or noise or tranquility. This was about control. And if there's one thing I've learned from raising bison, it's that control is an illusion. I didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to learn that lesson the hard way. If Karen's early antics were like a slow drip from a leaky faucet, the next phase was a busted pipe. Things went from mildly annoying to downright hostile. The speed bump was still fresh when I noticed something strange every time my trucks passed through the shared road. Someone would be standing there, phone in hand, filming, not discreetly right out in the open. The first few times, I ignored it. But one afternoon, after my feed delivery driver told me he'd been followed all the way back into town by an SUV, I started to realize this wasn't just about documenting noise violations. They were building some kind of case. 2 weeks later, I got my answer. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside was a letter on official HOA letterhead, signed by Karen herself. It claimed my livestock activities were in violation of community safety standards and demanded that I implement measures to reduce risk, things like limiting livestock access near the shared fence line, scheduling truck deliveries only between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., and notifying the HOA in writing before moving large equipment through HOA-adjacent areas. I set the letter down, laughed, and poured myself another coffee. The audacity would have been funny if it wasn't so intrusive, but it didn't stop there. A week after the letter, a county animal control officer knocked on my door. He'd received anonymous complaints about underfed bison on my property. The guy was polite, clearly embarrassed to be there, and after a quick look around, he apologized for wasting my time, but he also confirmed something I already knew: Karen was behind it. By this point, I'd started keeping a journal. Every incident, no matter how small, went into it: dates, times, descriptions, even license plates when I could get them. I didn't know exactly where this was heading, but I had a feeling evidence was going to matter. Then came the drone. It was a warm, breezy afternoon, and I was checking fence posts on the south pasture when I heard a faint buzzing overhead. Looking up, I saw it: a black quadcopter with a little camera blinking red. It was hovering just 20 feet above my herd, tilting back and forth as if sizing them up. Bison don't take kindly to strange noises. A few of the bulls lifted their heads, snorting. One took a slow step toward the sound. I could see where this was going, so I pulled out my phone, filmed the whole thing, and watched as the drone retreated in a hurry when one of the cows made a mock charge. The next day, I found Karen at the local grocery store, chatting with another HOA board member near the bakery section. She didn't acknowledge me, but I caught enough of the conversation to hear her brag about getting aerial footage for the HOA's livestock hazard report. That was the moment my patience started wearing thin. Then, as if on cue, she escalated again, this time targeting my access to water. There's a narrow creek that runs along part of my property line before crossing under the shared road and winding into HOA land. My cattle guard keeps the bison from crossing, but the creek's natural flow has always been a shared resource for wildlife and livestock. One morning, I found a stack of sandbags and a crude plywood dam blocking the creek right where it crossed into my property. I don't have proof Karen ordered it, but the HOA maintenance team was spotted working there just a day earlier. The water level in my lower pasture trough dropped by half in less than a week. That one got me hot under the collar. Not only was it petty, it was illegal. I called the county water rights office and filed a complaint. They promised to investigate, but I knew government wheels turned slowly. In the meantime, I had a herd to care for, and my patience for HOA games was running on fumes. But Karen wasn't done. The final straw came on a windy Thursday afternoon. My ranch hand, Luke, called me from the main gate, his voice tight. "Boss, you're not going to like this." I drove down and saw it for myself, a brand new steel padlock hanging from the chain on my gate. And not just any lock, this one was welded through the links, solid as a rock. Luke told me he'd seen a white SUV drive off just minutes earlier. I didn't need to guess who it was. The lock wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a problem. My hay delivery was due within the hour, and without access through that gate, the truck would have to backtrack 15 miles to the service road, burning fuel and time I couldn't afford to waste. I grabbed my bolt cutters and snapped it off, tossing the metal carcass into the back of my truck. But as I stood there, chain in my hands, I realized something. Karen had just crossed a line from harassment into outright interference with my legal property access. And the thing about crossing a line is, once you do it, you can't go back. She thought she was tightening the leash. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me the very leverage I needed to turn the tables. The bison weren't part of the plan yet, but they would be. And when the time came, she was going to regret every single stunt she'd pulled. 2 days after the padlock stunt, I decided it was time to stop reacting and start paying closer attention. Karen was clearly willing to push boundaries, and I needed to know just how far her reach went and where it stopped. That meant information. And in a town like ours, information doesn't come from Google searches or official records alone. It comes from conversations, overheard gossip, and knowing which bar stools to occupy when the right people are talking. I started with the Lakeshore Diner, a little spot off Highway 212 where ranchers, construction crews, and the occasional HOA member all mingled over coffee. I made a habit of lingering after my meals, pretending to read the paper while letting the chatter flow around me. It paid off quicker than I expected. One morning, I caught wind of 2 HOA board members, Phil and Denise, arguing in the booth behind me. Phil was frustrated about the budget being drained by maintenance emergencies. Denise shot back that Karen refuses to approve the fence replacement until she gets her landscaping project funded. That perked my ears right up. I'd noticed their perimeter fence, the one separating the HOA's manicured lawns from my south pasture, was looking rough. Leaning posts, warped rails, and spots where the wire sagged low enough a determined deer could hop right over. I'd chalked it up to neglect, but now I understood it was more than that. They couldn't agree on how to pay for it, and that meant repairs were delayed. I filed that away and kept listening. Phil went on to mention that HOA bylaws required any major repair fences included to be voted on by the entire membership. That meant even if they wanted to patch things up quickly, they'd need a formal vote at the next quarterly meeting, and the next meeting not for another 6 weeks. By the time I finished my coffee, I had the seed of a plan forming in my mind, but information alone wasn't enough. I needed proof both of their harassment and their negligence. So I got to work. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and walked the entire stretch of shared fence between my ranch and the HOA. I photographed every weak post, every warped board, every place where rot had eaten away at the wood. I even measured a few gaps where the wire had been patched so many times it looked like a metal quilt. While I was at it, I documented the padlock incident in detail, photos of the broken lock, the chain, the bolt cutters lying beside them. I kept every letter, every friendly notice, and even pulled the security cam footage from my front gate, which clearly showed that white SUV stopping to tamper with it. I knew from experience that a paper trail wasn't just for court, it was insurance. You never know when you'll need to prove your side of the story, and the more thorough you are, the harder it is for anyone to spin it against you. Still, there was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to confirm. I called an old friend, Mike Donovan, who worked at the county zoning and code enforcement office. I told him I had a hypothetical question about livestock containment and liability. He chuckled. He knew me well enough to know when hypothetical meant something's about to go down. Mike confirmed what I was hoping if livestock wandered onto someone else's property. The property owner was only liable if they'd failed to maintain adequate fencing to keep them out. And adequate meant strong enough for the type of livestock known to border the property. In other words, if you live next to a bison ranch, your fence had better be built like a fortress. If it wasn't, and a 1,000-pound bull decided to visit your tulip beds, well, that was on you. That little nugget of information was pure gold. It meant that their crumbling fence wasn't just a cosmetic problem, it was a ticking time bomb, and the HOA was holding the detonator without realizing it. Now, I'm not the kind of man to go out of my way to cause trouble, but I am the kind of man who believes in letting people experience the consequences of their own actions, especially when they've worked this hard to earn them. I decided then and there to keep my cool a little longer. Let Karen think she was winning. Let her pile on just a bit more pressure. Make just a few more enemies in her own ranks. Because the more she pushed me, the sweeter the payoff would be when the tables turned. For the next couple of weeks, I kept my head down, fixed up my own fences, and went about my work as usual. But all the while, I was counting the sagging posts, noting how the storms loosened the rails, and waiting for the day that fence finally gave way. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I had a pretty good idea of how to help it along when the time was right. And the beauty of it was when it did happen, I wouldn't have to lift a finger. All I'd need to do was open a gate. For a short while, I thought maybe Karen had gotten bored. The letter stopped. No one was parked near my gate with a camera. Even the white SUV was nowhere to be seen. But that's the thing about people like her, they don't stop. They just regroup. The calm broke one Thursday morning in mid-June. Luke, my ranch hand, came into the barn shaking his head. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding out a folded sheet of paper. It was another HOA notice, but this one was different. Bold letters at the top read, "Cease and desist. Unauthorized use of HOA roads." It accused me of illegally accessing their private infrastructure, threatened legal action if I didn't immediately cease all unapproved traffic, and demanded I pay a $2,500 access impact fee. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Impact fee? What? For the tire tracks. Luke grinned, but I could see he was worried. The letter looked official enough to scare someone who didn't know better. That's Karen's real weapon, not force, but intimidation. I tossed the letter in my desk drawer, right on top of the growing stack of her nonsense, and went about my day. But the next move came faster than I expected. That Saturday, I was fixing the water troughs when Luke radioed me from the front gate again. His voice was tight. "Boss, we got a problem." I drove up and my stomach dropped. The steel padlock was back only this time. They'd upgraded. It wasn't just looped through the chain. They'd welded a steel plate across the gate itself. A shiny HOA property. No trespassing sign was bolted right onto my side. "This is going to take more than bolt cutters." Luke muttered. I stepped out, ran my hand over the cold steel, and exhaled slowly. The gall of it wasn't even what got me. It was the timing. I had a delivery truck less than an hour out, loaded with feed. Without that gate, the truck would have to take the service road 30 extra miles of detour on a rough, narrow path not meant for semis. I called the driver to reroute him, which meant unloading would now eat up half my day. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be found, but I didn't need to see her to know she was behind it. I called the county sheriff. He showed up in a dusty cruiser, took one look, and sighed. "Jack, this is beyond petty." "Yeah," I said, "but it's also illegal." "Right, sure is," he replied. "Easement rights are pretty clear. They can't block you from your own property." He took photos, filed a report, and promised to pass it to the county attorney. But I knew the legal process wouldn't move fast enough to undo the day's damage. Karen wasn't just trying to inconvenience me, she was trying to make a point, and she was confident enough to do it in broad daylight. 2 days later, she doubled down. This time, it wasn't my gate, it was my delivery. I got a call from my supplier saying their driver had been stopped at the HOA entrance and told to turn around. Apparently, a couple of HOA security volunteers in reflective vests had claimed the driver was trespassing and threatened to call the authorities. The driver wasn't from around here. He didn't want trouble, so he turned back without even calling me first. By the time I tracked him down, he was already heading home. That feed shipment was delayed by 3 days, which meant I had to scramble to make up for it with local purchases. Cost me twice what it should have. And if that wasn't enough, the cherry on top came a week later. I was heading into town when I spotted something new along the fence line, a row of bright orange construction stakes with little flags fluttering in the wind. A hand-painted sign read, "Future Site of HOA Perimeter Enhancement Project." Translation: they were planning to extend their fence higher and push it several feet closer to my pasture, probably to keep the bison at bay. But here's where Karen's arrogance really worked against her. When I stopped to take a closer look, I realized the flags were placed well inside my property line. Whether it was a mistake or intentional, it didn't matter, it was trespass. And the stakes ran right through a spot where the ground dipped and the fence was already leaning. That's when it clicked. She wasn't shoring up her defenses, she was stretching them thin. And every dollar they spent trying to fortify the fence was a dollar they weren't spending to fix the rotten sections I'd already documented. It was like watching someone patch the roof of a house while ignoring the fact that the foundation was crumbling. And here's the thing about foundations when they fail big. Karen thought she was tightening the noose. She didn't realize she was building the stage for her own public humiliation. By now, I had the legal backing, the photographic evidence, and the perfect understanding of their weakest link. All I needed was the right moment to act. It wouldn't be long before it came. And when it did, she wouldn't just lose her grip on me, she'd lose her grip on the whole HOA. The Bison were about to get involved. And let me tell you, when Bison get involved, nobody wins except the Bison. Once I knew Karen's fence was their Achilles heel, I stopped looking at her harassment as a nuisance and started seeing it as an opportunity. This wasn't just about getting my road access back anymore. It was about teaching the HOA, and Karen in particular, that you don't mess with someone who's willing to outweight you. The first step was locking down the legal side. I called up my attorney, Ben Hawthorne, a wiry old cowboy turned lawyer who still wore boots to court. He'd handled water rights disputes and grazing claims for half the ranchers in the county. When I laid out what Karen had done, padlocks, delivery interference, trespassing with those fence stakes, he let out a low whistle. "Jack," he said, "this is better than a Christmas bonus. You've got documented easement violations, property encroachment, and harassment. One more good push, and we could bury them in injunctions." I smiled. "Not looking to bury them, Ben. Just want to make sure they stop before I have to." Ben agreed to draft a cease and desist letter citing specific statutes, but I told him not to send it yet. Timing was everything. I wanted that letter to land when they were already scrambling. Next, I called my friend Mike at zoning again, this time to get the exact wording on livestock containment responsibilities. He emailed me the section of county code that made my day. Any property bordering livestock must maintain a barrier sufficient to deter ingress, commensurate with the species known to be kept adjacent. Translation: if your neighbor's bison decide to visit, and your fence is a joke, you're the one holding the bill. With that in my back pocket, I moved to step 3, lining up my allies. I reached out to 2 of my fellow ranchers, Earl Simmons and Tom Red McAllister, whose properties also brushed against the HOA's southern edge. They'd been quietly fuming at Karen for years over petty complaints about dust drift and barn odors. When I told them what I had in mind, they grinned like kids hearing about a secret fishing hole. "Just let us know when to be ready," Red said, slapping me on the back. Preparation on the ground meant more than just waiting for the fence to fail. It meant making sure when it happened, the right eyes saw it. I bought 2 trail cameras and mounted them along the weak section of the HOA fence. They weren't for my herd, they were for documenting every creak, sag, and shift in those posts. In the meantime, I kept playing the part of the patient neighbor. I waved when HOA members drove past. I fixed my own fence lines. I even sent Luke into town to pick up extra hay just to keep the trucks off the road for a while. I wanted Karen lulled into thinking her tactics were working. Then Mother Nature gave me a little nudge. A summer storm rolled through one night, with wind that sounded like a freight train and rain that fell sideways. By morning, the HOA's fence was leaning even harder in 3 spots. I walked the line, camera in hand, noting where the nails had popped and the boards had warped from moisture. The trail cams caught something even better, 2 HOA maintenance guys inspecting the damage, shaking their heads, and then walking away without touching a thing. That told me they knew it was bad, and they were still stalling. I gave it another week. During that time, I made sure my herd was grazing in the north pasture, far from the weak fence. I didn't want to risk an accident too early, but I also started dropping subtle hints to Earl and Red that fence season was about to arrive. Finally, on a Friday morning, Karen handed me the last piece of the puzzle. Luke called over the radio. "Boss, the gate's locked again." This time, she didn't even bother hiding it. The padlock was shiny and new, and there was a laminated sign zip-tied to the chain. No access. By HOA order. I didn't cut it. Not yet. Instead, I turned my truck around and drove straight to the south pasture. I walked to the interior gate, the one separating my herd from the HOA fence, and unlatched it. The bison didn't rush, they never do. They moved like slow-moving thunder, massive shoulders rolling, heads swinging side to side. The bulls led, the cows followed, and the calves stuck close to their mothers. I stood there watching them graze their way closer to the fence. I didn't have to drive them, they'd get there on their own. Then I went back to the house, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and waited. Because once a bison decides a patch of grass looks greener on the other side, there isn't a fence post in the world that's going to stop it. And this fence didn't stand a chance. By mid-afternoon that Friday, the sky had turned the color of tarnished copper, the kind of heavy summer heat that makes the air feel like it's holding its breath. Out in the south pasture, my bison were grazing lazily, tails flicking at flies, inching ever closer to that tired old HOA fence. I didn't have to prod them. Bison are curious by nature, and the scent of fresh-cut grass from those manicured HOA lawns might as well have been a dinner bell. Around 3 o'clock, the first real contact happened. A big bull named Brutus, 1,800 pounds of solid muscle, wandered up to a sagging section where the top rail was already cracked. He leaned into it, just testing. The post shivered. The nails groaned. I sipped my coffee and leaned back in my porch chair. Brutus pulled back, pawed the dirt once, then hit it again, not a full charge, just enough to see what would happen. The post gave a little more. 2 cows followed, rubbing their shoulders against the rails like they were scratching an itch. That's all it took. With a sharp crack, the top board split. The middle rail sagged. And then, like water through a breached dam, the herd started moving. First Brutus stepped through, then the others, their massive bodies slipping into HOA territory as easy as walking through tall grass. Calves bounded after their mothers. Hooves clattered on asphalt as they spilled into the HOA's perfect cul-de-sac, snorting and blowing steam in the hot air. I grabbed my phone not to call for help, but to hit record. The first scream came from somewhere near the Miller place. A woman in yoga pants stood frozen on her driveway, clutching a watering can as Brutus ambled past her Lexus. He stopped to sniff a hedge, then casually knocked over a garden gnome with one horn. Further down, 2 yearlings found a patch of petunias and went to work like they'd been waiting all summer for the buffet to open. Within minutes, it was full-on pandemonium. HOA members darted from door to door, waving their arms and yelling, which only made the bison trot faster from yard to yard. A couple of bulls found the community's ornamental fountain and decided it made an excellent scratching post. The stonework didn't survive. I could hear Karen before I saw her. That voice could cut through a hurricane. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, stomping across her lawn toward Brutus. "Get them out! These are wild animals!" She turned and spotted me leaning on my fence, camera still rolling. "You call them back right now." I raised my free hand in a mock salute. "They're not dogs, Karen, and they're not wild. They're mine. Which means if they're on your property, it's your fence that failed." That's not, she sputtered, words tripping over themselves as another loud crack rang out. This time, it was the HOA's decorative trellis collapsing under the weight of a particularly itchy cow. Sirens wailed in the distance. The county sheriff's cruiser rolled in first, followed by an animal control truck. Behind them came two HOA board members in a golf cart, their faces pale as paper. The sheriff climbed out, took one look at the broken fence, and shook his head. "Well, this is a mess," Karen pounced. "Arrest him! He's letting dangerous animals roam free." The sheriff glanced at me, then back at her. "Actually, ma'am, the law says you're responsible for maintaining a fence strong enough to keep his bison out. I see a broken fence, and I see his animals walking through it. That's on you." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But ma'am," the sheriff interrupted. "I've got the county code right here. I suggest you call your insurance, because you're looking at property damage claims, animal control fees, and maybe some citations for interference with a legal easement." Her face went redder than a branding iron. Meanwhile, the animal control officer and a couple of deputies worked to slowly herd the bison back toward the breach. Brutus cooperated about as much as you'd expect, meaning it took 30 minutes, a lot of waving, and one strategically placed bucket of grain to get him moving. When the last calf trotted back through, I followed them in and shut the inner pasture gate. The HOA fence now had a gaping hole you could drive a tractor through. That's when I pulled out my final card. I walked up to the sheriff, handed him a thick envelope, and said, "Here's a file of every incident over the past 6 months. Photos, videos, letters, even the padlock on my gate. I think the county attorney's going to want to see it." The sheriff flipped it open, skimmed a few pages, and nodded. "This'll do." Karen glared at me like she wanted to burn a hole through my chest. "You planned this." I smiled just enough for her to see. "Karen, I've been trying to avoid trouble for months, but you just wouldn't quit. And the thing about Bison," I let the sentence hang, watching her fume, "they don't respect bad fences." She stormed off without another word, her heels sinking into the chewed-up turf that used to be her front lawn. By the time the last patrol car pulled away, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the pasture. My bison were calm, chewing cud like nothing had happened. The HOA, on the other hand, had just learned a very expensive lesson, and I had a feeling Karen's reign as queen bee was about to end. By Monday morning, Lakeshore Estates looked less like a pristine suburban dream and more like a war zone. The once perfect lawns were pockmarked with hoofprints. Flower beds were flattened. The ornamental fountain lay in a pile of rubble, and the HOA's proud white picket aesthetic was now interrupted by a 12-foot wide gap in the southern fence. And Karen Miller, she was nowhere to be seen. Word travels fast in a small town, and by breakfast at the diner, everyone knew what had gone down. Some of the other ranchers clapped me on the shoulder with a "heard you had some unexpected lawn service over at Lakeshore," while others just grinned knowingly. But the real news came midweek when the county attorney's office sent me a formal notice the HOA was being cited for failure to maintain adequate livestock barriers and for interference with an established easement. The fines alone were steep well into the thousands, but the kicker was the civil liability. Every homeowner whose property had been damaged could file a claim against the HOA's insurance, and that insurance would also be responsible for reimbursing me for the costs of rounding up and repasturing my herd. Ben, my lawyer, couldn't have been happier. "Jack, they've handed you the cleanest case I've seen in years. You play this right, and not only will they pay for every dime they've cost you, but they'll think twice before even breathing in your direction again." The HOA scrambled. Emergency meetings were called. The boardroom, usually Karen's personal stage, turned into a firing squad. But this time, she was the one in the crosshairs. I heard from Phil, the HOA treasurer, that tempers boiled over fast. Members were furious about the unexpected fines, the bad press, and the massive spike in their insurance premiums. Several demanded to know why the fence hadn't been repaired months ago, why padlocking my gate had been authorized without legal review, and why Karen seemed hell-bent on antagonizing a neighbor they had no jurisdiction over. By the end of that meeting, Karen had been voted out as HOA president in a landslide. She kept her house, but her voice in community affairs was reduced to the same as any other member, which, from what I hear, drove her up the wall. For me, the practical changes came quickly. The HOA agreed under legal pressure to put my easement rights in writing, complete with a clause prohibiting any future obstruction of the road. They replaced the entire southern fence, this time to a standard that could probably hold back a tank. And while I didn't get an apology from Karen herself, I did receive a formal letter from the HOA's attorney stating they would strive to maintain positive neighborly relations in the future. I pinned that one to my fridge. Life on the ranch slipped back into its old rhythm. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons in the pastures, and the occasional slow drive into town where I'd catch folks giving me that half smile that says, "I heard about your little adventure." The Bison, for their part, seemed none the worse for wear. Brutus was still king of the herd, and if he remembered his romp through HOA lawns, he didn't show it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't catch him now and then standing near the new fence, sniffing the air like he was looking for another weak spot. A few weeks after it all went down, I ran into Phil at the diner. He slid into the booth across from me and said, "You know, I don't think Karen's ever going to get over it." I shrugged. "Some folks just need to learn the hard way that control has its limits." He smirked. "Well, you sure found the limit." I just sipped my coffee and didn't argue. Because here's the truth Karen didn't lose to me. She lost to her own arrogance, to her belief that rules could bend reality, that a padlock could override common sense, that a fence could be ignored until it wasn't convenient anymore. And the best part, I didn't have to lift a hand in anger or break a single law. All I had to do was let nature and a little patience run its course. That's the thing about living out here. You learn to pick your battles. You learn when to fight and when to stand back and let the other person dig their own hole. Karen dug hers deep. And my Bison, well, they were just happy to help fill it in. Sometimes in life, the hardest thing to do is nothing. When someone pushes you, insults you, or tries to control you, your first instinct is to push back right away. But there's a quiet kind of strength and patience waiting for the right moment, letting the other person show the world exactly who they are without you lifting a finger. This wasn't just a story about fences and bison. It was about boundaries, the ones on your land and the ones in your life. If you let people push past them without consequence, they'll keep going. But if you stand firm, keep your dignity, and wait for the right moment to act, you can win without ever throwing a punch. So the next time someone tries to padlock your gate literally or figuratively, remember Brutus, remember the fence, and remember that sometimes the best revenge is letting people meet the results of their own choices. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a neighbor, boss, or HOA type push too far? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this little slice of ranch life, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you can join us for more tales from the fence line.